Come closer. The shadows have missed you, and tonight they have a new story to tell. Welcome to Scary Stories After Dark. By the time the first body was found on the steps of the Harvest Hollow post office, the sky had been gray for so long that people forgot what sunlight felt like. April in Harvest Hollow didn't feel like spring. It felt like someone had taken November, wrung out all its warmth, and left only the chill behind. Every street was a narrow vein of cracked pavement and leaning lampposts that hummed faintly in the evenings, like they were whispering to each other when no one was around. The air itself seemed wrong, cold when it shouldn't be, too still, too stale, as if it had been sitting for years and no one had thought to open a window. That morning, a mail carrier found him, Mr. Jacobson, the butcher, crumpled on the wide, mossy steps of the post office. His face was pale and slack, his mouth twisted open in a shape no scream could have held, his throat an ugly, torn mess. Nobody talked about it directly. They whispered instead. That was the Harvest Hollow way. Grief was always folded into quiet conversations and left on doorsteps like unwanted casseroles. The news drifted through town like wood smoke, sticking to everyone's clothes and skin. But the sky didn't brighten, the wind didn't move, nothing changed, except her. Simmy. She stood at her bedroom window, dark hair spilling over one shoulder, a chipped mug of coffee in her hands. Her cat, Felix, a gray tabby with a scar across one eye, sat on the windowsill, his tail flicking sharply back and forth, as if even he felt the unease pressing against the glass. "Don't look at me like that," she muttered, voice dry, more to herself than the cat. "I didn't kill the butcher." Felix blinked at her once, then turned his head to stare at the closet door across the room. He'd been doing that for weeks, just sitting there some nights, staring, hissing softly when the wind rattled the siding. She sipped her coffee, strong and bitter, and looked out across the town. Harvest Hollow wasn't large, just a scatter of old colonial homes, the occasional sagging farmhouse, and a downtown that still had a clock tower that hadn't worked in 15 years. There were no chain stores, no neon, only the mom and pop shops that had been there forever, the bookstore that smelled like mold, the diner that still used paper menus, the coffee shop that doubled as a used bookstore, the Dusty Page Cafe. That was where she, Nancy, and Grim spent most of their afternoons. Nancy, her best friend since the day they were both born. Literally, their mothers were roommates in the maternity ward, lived across the street. She was the softer edge to Simmy's sharpness, the kind of person who still made friendship bracelets and meant it. And then there was Grim. Grim had been their shadow since childhood, a gangly, sarcastic nerd with too many horror trivia facts rattling around his head, and a knack for making them laugh when everything felt heavy. The three of them made Harvest Hollow bearable, even beautiful, in its own strange way. But this morning, as Simmy sat her empty coffee mug on the windowsill and pulled on her leather jacket, it felt like the gloom had teeth. By the time she met Nancy and Grim at the Dusty Page Cafe, the whispers were louder. People were hunched over mugs, talking under their breath. The bell above the door jangled every time someone entered, and every head turned, watchful, cautious. Nancy pushed a coffee across the table toward her the second she sat down. "You heard about Jacobson," Nancy said quietly. Simmy arched a brow, grabbing the cup. "You mean the part where his throat looked like someone fed him to a wood chipper, or the part where people are pretending not to talk about it?" Nancy frowned, stirring her tea. "It's creepy, that's all." Grim smirked over the top of his book. "Maybe it's a bear," he said, voice flat, eyes glinting. Simmy blew on her coffee deadpan. Right, a bear that uses the front steps of the post office and leaves the cash register alone totally checks out. Their laughter came sharp and brittle, the kind that feels good for a second before it crumbles in your throat. Outside, the sky darkened even though it was barely noon, and down the street, a moving truck rolled past the post office, tires crunching on gravel, carrying with it something this town hadn't seen in years: new blood. And with it, Ellison. The moving truck lumbered down Hollow Street like it didn't belong, its rusted frame groaning under the weight of furniture wrapped in plastic. No one in Harvest Hollow really moved in anymore. People moved out. The houses that didn't empty stayed in the same families for generations, the same names on mailboxes, the same curtains in the windows. But that afternoon, the Colonial on the edge of town, the one that had sat with its for sale sign tilting for nearly 3 years, finally had life again. Simi noticed first. She was walking home from the dusty Page Cafe, Felix's cat hair still clinging to her black jeans, when she saw the truck parked out front. The house looked like it had been plucked from a postcard 50 years ago and dropped here to rot. White paint peeling, shutters sagging. The lawn was the color of ash, though it hadn't been winter for months. A man stepped out of the truck first, tall, lean, hair so dark it almost looked blue in the dim light. Ellison. He didn't look like he'd just moved to Harvest Hollow. He looked like he'd been waiting for it. He stood on the cracked walkway, scanning the street like he could feel the eyes on him from behind curtains, like he expected the town to be watching. And of course it was. Simi wasn't the only one who saw him. By the next day, whispers were everywhere. He's from the city. He was expelled from his last school. His parents are loaded. He doesn't blink enough. The rumors spread faster than the details about Jacobson's death, faster than the fear itself, and Ellison didn't do anything to stop them. He walked the halls of Harvest Hollow High like he owned them by the end of the week. His jackets, dark fitted, were suddenly the thing every guy wanted to wear. His haircut, sharp and deliberate, showed up on 3 different football players by Friday. Even the girls who would have sworn they weren't the type to swoon over anyone, swooned over him. He didn't say much. That might have been why they liked him. Simi hated that she noticed him. Hated that she felt his eyes on her when she wasn't looking. Hated that when they finally locked eyes across the cafeteria on Thursday, just for a moment, it felt like a hook sliding under her ribs. He smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. By Friday, even Grimm was cracking jokes about him. Ellison, huh? He said, leaning back in the booth at the Dusty Page Cafe, one leg hooked around the other. Sounds like the kind of name you give a cult leader. Simi stirred sugar into her coffee without looking up. Maybe he is one. He already has half the school dressing like him. Nancy frowned, picking at a muffin. He seems nice enough. Grimm smirked. Ted Bundy seemed nice enough too. The bell over the cafe door chimed. Simi didn't have to look. She knew who it was. Ellison stepped inside like he'd been coming there for years. Black coat hanging just right, eyes cutting through the room like a shadow. He didn't order coffee. He didn't even look at the menu. He just watched. And when his gaze slid over their booth, lingering on Simi for a heartbeat too long, the sugar spoon stilled in her hand. Because in that moment, for the briefest flicker, she swore his smile sharpened. The second death didn't make the front page. A florist, Mrs. Kemp, was found slumped over her work table in the greenhouse behind her shop, her neck at an angle that wasn't humanly possible. The greenhouse glass was fogged with condensation, streaked with handprints that didn't match hers. The police chalked it up to an accident, which was Harvest Hollow code for don't ask questions if you want to sleep tonight. The third death wasn't an accident. Mr. Dunn, the librarian, was discovered wedged between the stacks, throat gouged open, fingers broken backward like someone had been trying to pry something out of his hands. The whispers got louder. The town's heartbeat seemed to slow. People started locking their doors before sunset. Curtains were pulled earlier. The streets emptied, but the deaths didn't stop. Simi sat wedged into the corner booth at Dusty Page Cafe, the one by the rain-streaked window, coffee cooling in her hands. The cafe should have been buzzing. It always was this time of year, with seniors procrastinating essays and the locals crowding in for cheap muffins, but it was quiet now, too quiet. Nancy stirred her tea, looking anywhere but at the headlines in the folded newspaper on their table. Second local death rocks Harvest Hollow. Simi nudged it aside with her elbow. You know, at this point, we're one creepy doll away from becoming an actual horror movie. Nancy's laugh came out small, brittle. Don't say that. Grim smirked from across the table, his voice just as dry as Simi's. Why? You think the creepy doll might be Ellison? Simi didn't answer because she'd seen something. Last night, walking home, she'd passed the old train station, abandoned for decades, its windows black with grime, and there he was. Ellison. Standing in the dark, staring at the station like something inside was staring back. He hadn't moved, hadn't blinked, just stood there, his shadow stretching longer than it should have across the gravel. When she'd blinked, he was gone. Now, in the cafe, Nancy's phone buzzed with another news alert, another death. Simi didn't even flinch. Maybe it's a bear, Grim said again, half-heartedly this time, sipping his coffee like it might keep the chill from creeping under his skin. Simi smirked without looking up. Right, a bear that rips out throats, breaks bones, and somehow manages to lock the door behind itself. Grim's smile faded. Just saying. Outside, the streets of Harvest Hollow looked wrong, like the town itself was unraveling. Shops closed early, windows stayed dark. The clock tower in the center of town hadn't chimed in years, but the townspeople swore they could hear faint ticking if they stood too close to it now. And down the street, Simi spotted him again. Ellison. Standing in front of the boarded-up movie theater this time, his face tilted up toward the broken marquee. He didn't look at her, didn't move, but even from across the street, she felt it, the same wrong hook under her ribs tugging. By the time she got home that night, Felix the cat was sitting in front of her closet door again, fur on end, eyes locked on the gap at the bottom. He hissed once, low and sharp, like he'd seen something Simi hadn't. She closed the door, locked it, but the feeling didn't leave, because every death felt like it was pulling Harvest Hollow deeper into something. And Ellison felt like he was already standing at the bottom, waiting. By the second week of May, Ellison wasn't just the new kid. He was Harvest Hollow High's gravity. Everyone orbited him. The way he wore his collar turned up, the way he stood just outside of circles, like he was letting people come to him. It was all being copied, mimicked, absorbed. Even the teachers seemed softer toward him, their voices dropping when he passed, like they didn't want to disturb something they couldn't name. And that was what made Simi, Nancy, and Grim stop joking. It was easy to laugh about him when he was just weird. It was harder when the town deaths started to feel connected. At first, they weren't really stalking him. That's what Nancy insisted. "We're just observing," she said one night, hugging her jacket tight as they crouched behind the twisted wrought iron gate of the old Harrington property, watching Ellison's shadow move through the empty street. Grim snorted. "Observing is what scientists do. This is literally stalking." Simi didn't say anything. Her eyes stayed on Ellison's figure, the way his steps were too measured, his head turning slightly as though he could hear things no one else could. They started noticing patterns. He walked home alone every night, but never the same way twice. He lingered near places the deaths had happened, never looking directly, but always nearby. Sometimes he'd stop in the middle of the street and tilt his head back like he was listening to something in the sky. Once, they followed him all the way to the abandoned hollow mill, a place everyone avoided because it still smelled faintly of rust and oil, even decades after it shut down. Ellison just stood at the entrance, looking at the black maw of the doorway. Then, without warning, he turned and looked straight at them. Nancy gasped, stumbling back behind the wall. Grim muttered, "He saw us. He totally saw us." But when they peeked out again, Ellison was gone. The next day at school, he wasn't angry. He wasn't even curious. He just smiled at Simi when their eyes met in the hall, the kind of smile that didn't feel human at all. By the third week, Ellison's shadow stretched over everything, even prom. Flyers were taped up everywhere. The theme, "A Night Under the Stars," feeling almost insulting in a town that hadn't seen the stars in months. And then it happened. Ellison asked Nancy to prom. Not Simi, Nancy. It happened in the hallway between classes, no build-up, no awkwardness, just Ellison stepping close, his voice low, his smile too sharp. Nancy said yes, of course she did. Who wouldn't? Simi smiled when Nancy told her that night. She even made a sarcastic joke, something about, "Guess I'll just crown you prom queen and hand you the scepter myself." But when Nancy wasn't looking, Simi's fingers clenched hard enough around her coffee mug that it cracked. That night she couldn't sleep. Felix hissed at the closet again, and in the street outside she swore she saw Ellison standing under the single flickering lamppost, not moving, not blinking, watching the house. The screaming started before the music even began. Simi had barely stepped through the double doors of the Harvest Hollow Civic Hall, a building so old the paint peeled from the walls in long strips, when someone shrieked near the refreshment table. Then another. By the time she realized the screams weren't from excitement or a spilled drink, the first body hit the floor. A boy from her chemistry class, crumpled in his suit, a dark stain spreading across his pale blue shirt. The DJ froze. The teachers by the door didn't move. For one disorienting second, the whole room held its breath. Then the music cut out, and Ellison stepped forward. He looked different under the prom lights. Not handsome, wrong. His black suit clung too tightly to his frame, like it was holding something in, seams straining as his shoulders twitched. His smile, too wide, split his face in a way no human face should move. "Ellison," Nancy whispered, gripping Simi's arm, nails digging through the thin fabric of her dress. Ellison tilted his head, and his skin shifted. It wasn't peeling or ripping, it was sliding off. The black suit shredded, seams popping like gunshots. Something unfolded from beneath, too tall, too thin, all teeth and slick obsidian skin that reflected the harsh fluorescent lights like oil. Ellison wasn't Ellison anymore. He was something else. Something hungry. The hall erupted. Students screamed, tripping over gowns and folding chairs. Someone slammed into the punch table, sending sticky red liquid cascading across the floor like blood. Ellison moved through the chaos like a shark, fast and precise. One swipe, a student's torso split open, another lunge. Someone's head hit the floor, eyes still open. The screams became a single deafening note. Nancy stumbled back, heels sliding on spilled punch. Grim grabbed her hand, shouting something, words Simi couldn't hear over the roar of panic. But Ellison's eyes were already locked on Nancy, not just looking, choosing. The monster's head tilted, jerking unnaturally, his black eyes widening as his gaze locked on her. Nancy froze, breath coming in tiny, terrified gasps. Ellison moved toward her, slowly at first, then faster, a blur of claws and jagged teeth cutting through the air like blades. Simmy's breath hitched, her chest tightened. Not Nancy. She shoved through panicked bodies, students clawing at the locked doors, blood smearing on her arms as she fought her way closer. Her ears rang with screaming, Nancy's, the crowd's, maybe her own. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it, but Ellison was already there, towering over Nancy, teeth inches from her throat, and something in Simmy snapped. Her bones cracked, her skin split. It wasn't slow, it wasn't graceful, it was violent. Her body jerked as if pulled by invisible strings, her spine arching unnaturally as her arms lengthened, her face sharpened. In seconds, the prom queen was gone, and in her place was something monstrous. A praying mantis humanoid, green-black carapace gleaming under the disco lights, spined arms slicing through the humid air, eyes wide and glistening. The crowd screamed louder. Ellison didn't. Ellison smiled. The monsters collided. Simmy lunged, claws tearing through the remnants of his suit. Ellison struck back, his teeth sinking into her shoulder, black blood spraying across the parquet floor. Students scattered, trampled, clawed at locked doors. Some didn't make it out. Ellison slammed her into the refreshment table, wood splintering under her weight. Simmy's claws sliced across his chest, cracking through that oily armor-like skin. He screamed, a sound that wasn't human, a high, warbling shriek that made everyone left in the room clutch their ears. She didn't let go. She couldn't. Nancy's voice cut through the noise, trembling, desperate. Simmy. Simmy pinned Ellison to the floor, her mantis jaws clicking open, mandibles tearing. He bucked, his claws raking across her carapace, but she was stronger. She always had been. Her claws shot forward, gripping his head, and she did what mantises do. She ripped it off and ate it. The room went still. Blood, black and red, pooled beneath the toppled tables. Ellison's twitching body slumped, neck stump hissing like it was still trying to speak. For a moment there was only Simmy standing in the ruin of her prom dress, insect form dripping with gore, breathing hard. Then a sound. Snapping. Dozens of bones cracking in unison. The sound of snapping filled the civic hall. It was slow at first, like the creak of an old tree in the wind, then louder, closer, until it was everywhere at once. Every teacher, every chaperone, even the principal, they stood still, blood spattered, their faces blank as their bodies began to change. Mr. Calder, the vice principal, hunched forward, his shoulders rising unnaturally high, the seams of his suit splitting as his arms bent the wrong way. Mrs. Adley, the math teacher, reached up and calmly plucked off her glasses as her jaw unhinged, snapping wider and wider until it cracked in two places. The principal, buttoned up, polite Mr. Heron, tilted his head like he'd heard a far-off whisper. The sound of cartilage tearing echoed as his neck stretched in slow, wet increments. And then, all at once, skin split. They weren't human underneath, not fully. Their clothes shredded as something slick and green-black pushed through, plates of hard carapace glinting under the flickering disco lights. Their eyes, wide, unblinking, and faceted like a fly's, caught the light and threw it back in 100 shards. One of the teachers crouched down, clawed hands dragging across the parquet floor, and sniffed Ellison's headless body. Then they all descended. The faculty swarmed Ellison like vultures, only worse. Hands became claws, mouths split wider. They tore into him with methodical hunger, the way predators finish off prey. Blood sprayed across the torn streamers and the toppled punch bowls. Simi stood frozen, her mantis form slick with gore, claws trembling, her breathing ragged. Nancy clung to Grim, both of them pressed against the wall, too terrified to speak. This wasn't just Ellison's nightmare anymore. This was something bigger, something older, something rooted in Harvest Hollow. The principal rose from the pile, his jaw smeared with black blood. He calmly straightened his tattered tie, smoothed his jacket like he hadn't just eaten what was left of Ellison. Then he spoke, voice perfectly steady, almost polite. "Gas leak," he said, brushing gore from his lapel. "We'll say it was a gas leak." The others nodded, murmuring in agreement, their insect jaws twitching. They moved like a cleanup crew, efficient, terrifying, practiced. Bodies were dragged. Blood was mopped with tablecloths. The prom decorations, streamers, balloons, even the shattered disco ball were methodically stripped away. Every trace of the massacre was being erased while half the senior class lay dead. Nancy's voice finally broke the silence, so small, so cracked, it barely existed. "Simi." Her eyes darted from her friend's insect form to the swarming staff, her voice trembling. "What are they?" Simi didn't answer, because she didn't know how. Minutes stretched, long and brittle. By the time the last body was gone, the civic hall looked almost normal. Almost. Except for the smell. The principal turned his many-faceted eyes to Simi, standing there in her mantis form. He didn't attack. He didn't look afraid. He just gave a single slow nod, like an acknowledgement, like a warning, and said, "Get cleaned up, go home." By dawn, the story was written: gas leak, a tragic accident that killed most of the senior class. The hall was sealed off. The police, those who weren't in on it, were fed lies. The press release was already drafted before sunrise. Simi, Nancy, and Grim walked home in silence. Their prom clothes were shredded, their shoes soaked in blood. The streets were empty. The sky was the same dull gray it had been for months. None of them spoke. Not when they passed the post office where Jacobson's body had been found. Not when Felix yowled from Simi's window as if he already knew. Nancy finally whispered, "Are we safe?" Simi didn't answer, because in her head she could still hear the snapping, and she could still hear the murmurs of the staff. Ellison might be gone, but his parents weren't. By the time the civic hall doors opened again, it was nearly dawn. The street outside was empty, just the faint hum of power lines and the gray wash of a sky that never seemed to change. Simi, Nancy, and Grim stepped out first. Their dresses and suits were shredded, their shoes sticky with blood that would never come out. None of them spoke. They just walked, past the police cars with their lights off, past the quiet teachers who were already pretending to look normal again, past the barricades that would, by noon, keep out any curious eyes. The world was silent. Too silent. They didn't go their separate ways. Nancy and Grim didn't even ask. They just followed Simi, all of them pulling their jackets tighter like that could block out what they'd seen. Nancy's hands shook as she hugged her arms around herself, voice breaking the long, heavy quiet. "They're just going to cover it up?" Her words sounded ridiculous out loud, like even she didn't believe them. Grim, usually quick with sarcasm, didn't answer. His jaw was clenched so tight it looked like it hurt. Simi walked a step ahead, eyes fixed forward. She didn't turn around. By the time they reached their street, the sun hadn't risen, not really. Just a lighter shade of gray hanging low in the sky. Nancy's voice came again, smaller this time, fraying at the edges. "Are we safe now?" The question hung there like frost on the air. Simi stopped walking. She stared at the cracked pavement, the old lamppost, the rows of houses with their curtains drawn tight. Her mantis form had melted away hours ago, but she could still feel it under her skin, the weight of it, the hum in her bones, the way Ellison's blood tasted. She didn't turn to Nancy, she didn't answer, because the truth was worse than anything she could say. Far down the street, in the pale gray morning, something moved. A car she didn't recognize rolled slowly past the gas station. Inside, a woman's face, beautiful, sharp, and utterly still, stared out the window. Next to her, a man with the same black hair as Ellison rested his hand on the steering wheel. They didn't stop. They didn't wave. They just drove by, eyes locked on the three blood-streaked teens, heads turning in unison to watch until the car disappeared into the foggy horizon. Nancy whispered again, but this time it wasn't a question. That was them. Simi said nothing. The sound of the car's engine faded, but the weight of their gaze stayed, heavy and choking. Ellison was gone, but his parents weren't. And Harvest Hollow? Harvest Hollow would always be hungry,